Well, good afternoon. I'm Julie Broadway, President of the American Horse Council. Greetings from snowy Washington, D.C. We're delighted to have you with us on this lovely Valentine's Day, and I'm really excited about this program. So without further ado, as they say, I'm going to turn this over to our resident researcher and extraordinary program manager for the Equine Welfare Data Collective, Emily Stearns.
Thank you, Julie. So welcome everyone to our webinar, Love to the Rescue. And today's webinar, we are going to discuss basically what we're seeing in equine welfare statistics, what other groups are seeing in dog and cat welfare statistics, and kind of how it all works together and what maybe some of the different, I don't want to say issues, but just kind of background operations and logistical differences are happening out there, and kind of why we see some of the number differences we're seeing between dog and cat welfare and horse welfare. So first of all, to introduce us, we are the Equine Welfare Data Collective. And our overarching goal is to provide kind of the critical data needed to drive program development and identify areas of concern, which allows equine welfare organizations, industry leaders, municipal bodies, grant funders, all those kind of critical organizations working in equine welfare to address the needs within their community and kind of help build and direct programming to assist owners and horses that in need. And if you want to see some of what we're doing, you can check out our website at unitedhorsecoalition.org/EWDC. There you can see all of our current data reports. You can check out all the different ways organizations are submitting data to us. And that also allows you to see all the different educational materials that the United Horse Coalition has going on to help owners. We are a grant-funded program, so we are a program technically of the United Horse Coalition through the American Horse Council Foundation, and our current funding support comes from the ASPCA, as well as their program, the Right Horse Initiative, the Foundation for the Horse, and we've previously had a grant from the USA Equestrian Trust. I'm Emily Stearns. I am the program manager for the Equine Welfare Data Collective. And if you have any questions today, not just about the data we're going to talk about, but just about the Equine Welfare Data Collective in general, you're always welcome to email me at ewdc@horsecouncil.org. And I'm always available via email. And if you can't reach me, you're always welcome to reach out to Ashley, who's one of our panelists at the end today. So we have a lot of data that we're going to kind of digest today. But most importantly, what I want to make sure you all understand is that all of this data is freely accessible to the public. And there's a lot of different locations that you can find the information we're going to talk about today. And all of the data points we're going to talk about, I have cited, so you know specifically what organization that information has come from. But just in general, for the EWDC, for our reports, these are some of the locations that we go to look at data, see what other data is out there, and kind of how it works into the story of equine welfare as a whole. So our first data source that we look at is our own, from our own data collection program, the Equine Welfare Data Collective. Like I said, you can view all of our current reports. One is about to publish this week or next week, kind of depending on when our peer review gets back. And you can see those all for free at our website. There's also the American Horse Council, the Economic Impact Study. We have Julie, I'm sure, would be happy to talk about how we're just about to start the next economic impact study, but the most recent economic impact study is available at the American Horse Council website. And then we also look at data from the US government. So there's the USDA, and there you can track things like imports and exports of horses, where they're coming into the country from, where they're going to when they're being exported out of the country, as well as federal census information. And sometimes it might be kind of hard to see why it might be important to look at the people information when we're talking about animal welfare. But for the Equine Welfare Data Collective, in our previous reports, we have looked at things like median income levels, regional population density, other people info like age, household income, all this that kind of really starts to help build a story about horses that are entering welfare programs and the regional information that they're coming from. And then on the animal side of things, we have the ASPCA, Best Friends Network, the AVMA, Shelter Animals Count, and Pet Point Reporting. And all of these organizations have very robust and extensive sheltering research available that's free to access. So you can check out their websites there. That's where we go for information. And the ASPCA, and I believe Shelter Animals Counts, they have horse information too as well. So it's not just dog and cat information. It's all really, really good research that is free to access, which is always so, so important. For us, for any of you out there who are attending from welfare organizations yourself, and if you're not already participating in the Equine Welfare Data Collective and you would like to, you can check out our website, unitedhorsecoalition.org /submit data, and that way you can see how we're collecting data and where our data reports are. I'm just going to ask once to please just double check that you're muting your microphone.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to see. This is
So moving forward, oh, my computer doesn't wish to, there we go. The first thing we're going to look at is population of animals and population of welfare organizations itself. So national populations of animals, this is really kind of where the numbers game begins. So looking at dogs, it's estimated that there are over 75 million dogs in the US and nearly 60 million cats. And just kind of the sheer thought of those numbers is immense to kind of understand. On the horse side, we're looking at over 7 million horses. And so when we think about population and accessibility to services, it's really important to kind of understand the population in need and how to kind of evaluate how we access that population in need and what percent of population is in need. So in terms of assisting animals in need, we have over 14,000 companion animal shelters and rescues. So this doesn't necessarily mean that there are 14,000 brick and mortar, so physical buildings that you can bring a dog or a cat to for assistance. This means there are 14,000 programs or 14,000 organizations. And they're all doing various different things to assist animals in need. They might be doing adoptions, they might be doing just kind of foster situations and foster care situations. On top of that, they might even just be providing feed services, veterinary assistance services. So I've seen estimates anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 physical buildings, and that includes municipal shelters that will take custody of an owner relinquished or a stray animal. But that number I've seen kind of a lot of range on. So I really want to focus on the fact that there's over 14,000 companion animal organizations, essentially. On the flip side of that, in equine, we have 1,000 equine related shelters, rescues, and sanctuaries. And this covers kind of a vast number or vast amount of types of organizations. So we have organizations that are taking custody of horses for adoption. We have organizations that are facilitating what we call direct placement programs. So that's things like the Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance, which has so many different kind of affiliate organizations that are helping trainers place horses without people having to take custody of them in between. That also is inclusive of things like full circle programs with the Arabians and the Morgans. It also includes hay banks, feed banks, castration services. The EWDC has identified over 900 kind of organizations that we call them custodial organizations that will take physical custody of an animal. And that means they might be housed in a foster care situation or in a, kind of standard, when we think animal shelter stall situation for a horse. But over 900 organizations, equine organizations, can physically take custody of an animal from an owner in need who needs help. Looking at big picture, how does this all play out? So that means with dogs and cats, there's about one organization for every 5,500 dogs and every 4,100 cats in the US. And one organization for every 7,200 equines in the US. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean good or bad things. So this is the important part to understand about data. With the EWDC, when we look at data, you have to kind of look at the numbers And you can make all the inferences you want, but you have to be cautious that nothing really means anything until we have more information. So is it a good or bad thing that there's fewer organizations per horse? No, not necessarily, because that's not necessarily a commentary on capacity to assist owners or accessibility to assist owners. But it is an important part of the discussion. If there's fewer organizations per equine, what does that mean for capacity and ability to assist? And the first thing I want to look at, and when we're talking about custodial organizations, something that always comes up is length of stay. So this graphic is from the Pet Point. They have a new accessible database where anybody can log in and see all of the data in real time from Pet Point shelter software users. So this is just from their kind of beta launch that happened this year. And basically on average, length of stay for small animals, non-horses, we're talking dogs, we're talking cats, is about 30 days or less. And that's not necessarily dependent on what the specific outcome is, whether they're returned to the owner or adopted. For cats, maybe they're trapped, neutered, released, maybe they're euthanized if they have medical issues. But the average amount of time that animal is spending in the care of a custodial organization using resources, whether that be physical labor, food, financial, is about 30 days. How does that compare to horses? I'm sure all of you rescue people out there are kind of already knowing where this is going. When we're looking at length of stay in horses, and just to make sure we're all clear, this is kind of preliminary data. It's a small sample size, but it's important to look at because I think it is pretty reflective of what's happening out there. For custodial organizations, so these are organizations that take physical custody of horses, we're looking at over 200 days in shelters, consuming resources, training, feeding, husbandry, labor, all that kind of stuff. For rescue and municipal shelters, so these are municipal controlled facilities, which for horses, as far as we're aware, there are very few comparative to dogs and cats. We're looking at over 300 days, which is a lot. And then for sanctuaries that also do adoption, we're looking at about 400 days. And for sanctuaries that do not plan on doing adoption, we're looking at about 3,000 days or just under 10 years. So what that means is once a horse is taken into the custody of a sanctuary with the intent to care for it for its entire life, that horse may be in that sanctuary being cared for upwards to 10 years. So comparative just to lifespan of dogs and cats, horses in sanctuaries are, we can't make assumptions, but in my mind, when I think of a horse going into a sanctuary, they might be probably older than 10 years old already. Maybe they have some reason they're not able to be rehomed. So for 10 years, that horse is going to need a significant amount of resources because everything's bigger in sheltering and everything's bigger with horse sheltering. So that means even the feed bills are going to be bigger with horse sheltering. Our vet bills are going to be bigger with horse sheltering. So it's pretty interesting to see the differences in length of stay. And we'll talk more at the end of this webinar about what some of those logistical differences are. But just in terms of thinking about how we plan for caring for horses in shelter, understanding that length of stay is kind of majorly different for many of these organizations for large animals compared to small animals is a pretty significant thing to consider. Now, looking at our 900 or so custodial organizations, in the EWDC second report that we released, we were able to determine that there's roughly, kind of somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 physical placements for horses on any given day. So that might mean if, say, we're operating at about 75% capacity full every day, maybe there's about somewhere between 35,000, around 35,000 horses in physical custody of shelters on a day-to-day basis. And there's room for more. Maybe there's less, kind of depending on seasonality and what's happening in the economy. If I had a magic crystal ball to tell you what was going to happen with COVID, I think I could probably be a millionaire, but it's all wait and see at this point and see how the data shakes out. But so why is it important to know the daily maximum capacity? Well, in terms of length of stay, this means that we can potentially estimate how many horses are using resources in custodial organizations and accessing resources in custodial organizations on an annual basis. So looking at this kind of roughly 45,000 estimated daily capacity with a roughly somewhere between 200 and 250 day length of stay, there's potentially 70,000 horses. And I really want to emphasize potentially, because again, this is preliminary data for us. 70,000 horses annually based on our current daily max capacity and length of stay information accessing custodial services every year, compared to 3.1 million dogs and 3.2 million cats. And that comes from the shelter animals count data from 2019. So how do we put this into perspective? So that means roughly 4% of all dogs in the country and 5% of all cats in the country and 1% of all horses in the country annually are accessing these custodial services. Does this mean a smaller percentage of horses compared to dogs and cats need help or need sources? We have no idea. All this is really is a reflection on capacity and accessibility and how animals are rehomed. And we're going to look at intakes and outcomes by type compared to dogs, cats, and horses in the next couple slides. But it's really important to remember that just because fewer horses are accessing services doesn't necessarily mean that fewer horses need services. It's more just in terms of what's available in that locality and how they're able to be provided. And this is also kind of, again, not a whole picture, as we don't yet know how many horses are being rehomed through direct placement programs. That's a really important kind of critical aspect of horse sheltering and adoption at the moment, because there's been so much growth in that area over the past 10 years as these programs have really kind of picked up and been developed. So we don't know yet for sure how many horses are being rehomed through direct placement. We also don't know for dogs and cats how many animals are being rehomed through direct placement. So it's not really a fair comparison in terms of that aspect. So we want to know in the future how many animals are being rehomed. But again, it's one of those, we need more information, But in terms of custodial services, this is what it's looking at currently. And if any of you do have questions in the chat, Julie and Ashley are keeping an eye on it, and we'll discuss all questions at the end. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. So looking at intakes by type, here on the slide, we have on the left intakes for the EWDC for horses from January to June in 2019. And then on the right, we have dog and cat intake by type January through September, and this is from shelter animal counts, and they're both for 2019. And the difference in time span is just difference in how these two organizations report and collect data. So some of the key takeaways on this are actually what I think a really good picture of how logistics impact animal sheltering and the ability to provide aid for animal welfare programs. For horses, we have 13% of intakes for that time period for horses were reported as coming from auctions or private kill buyer kind of ransom situations. We don't see that in dogs and cats because it's an entirely different process of rehoming. There's no kind of huge dog and cat auctions that are open to the public. So that's why we see these numbers coming from horses and not dogs and cats. For horses, we see 11% are transferred in from another organization compared to dog and cats that are looking at 18% for the same time period. In terms of transfers, the Time magazine, I don't know who saw it, just did a really wonderful article on dogs being transferred from the southern states that have really high capacity situations to northern states where we have fewer dogs in shelters and a lot of adopters looking for dogs. Those programs are relatively new in the horse world. They're there, they're happening. ASPCA has the Horse Adoption Express through the Right Horse, which is really exciting to kind of watch that grow. So it's happening, it's growing, there's space for it out there, but we're still kind of in the horse world a little behind dogs and cats in terms of that logistically. So it'll be interesting to see how that number changes as time goes on. The other one that I always kind of, I don't want to say chuckle at, but like, oh yeah, that makes sense in terms of data, is looking at stray animals. So 3% of horses come into shelters for this time period as stray horses. So that means they're coming in feral, from kind of vacant land. They might be lost, but you know, I don't want to say it's hard to have stray horses, but there's very limited areas of the country where that's a realistic issue that needs to be dealt with. Here in New England, we don't see a lot of stray horses. You know, it's going to be pretty noticeable pretty quick if someone's horse is missing out of their yard and someone has to go pick it up. In places like West Virginia, where they have the feral mine horses, that's a much bigger concern. And they're going to have much higher numbers of horses coming in as stray. So this is compared to dogs and cats, where 50% of dogs and cats are coming in as stray. So that's a very significant difference. And again, that's just really telling of kind of the logistical differences of keeping these animals and how owners are keeping these animals. We also have owner surrenders. So in horses, we have much, much higher numbers of owner surrenders, owner relinquishments. Nearly 50% of horses coming into these shelter situations for that time period were owner surrenders. That means owners seeking out help, getting help, rehoming their horse, compared to 26% for dogs and cats. And we also have law enforcement confiscations. So in horses, I don't want to say it's a commonality, but it's not infrequent to have animal control, local law enforcement working with rescues to help confiscate horses from situations of neglect, medical need, owners just in kind of desperate help that let things go too far. So 17% of horses in this time period were taken into shelters through law enforcement situations, compared to 1% for dogs and cats, or even less than 1%. It just kind of falls into the other area for dogs and cats. So again, this is a pretty significant kind of logistical thing that helps people look at how is sheltering different for horses, and how are the types of animals coming into sheltering different. So when we think of law enforcement confiscation for horses, and I'm sure our panel today will love to chat about law enforcement confiscation for horses, but when my experience with law enforcement confiscation, the health of horses, the behavior of horses who have been confiscated by law enforcement, it needs a lot of support and it needs a lot of care. So those are potentially horses that might need longer amounts of care or more resources to be supported. So it's interesting to think about how that might affect resource distribution in shelters and their needs and how they assess their needs. Looking at outcomes, there's some very key takeaways in outcomes. So again, these are for the same time periods from the same two organizations. We have 79% of horses are adopted, which is a huge number. I'm always very excited to report that number. So nearly 80% of horses, and this number has been really steady through all of our reporting, are adopted to new owners that come into shelters. And this is compared to 53% of dogs and cats. And this isn't like saying, oh no, dogs and cats are doing really poorly on adopting. This is really telling about logistical differences. So cats coming into shelters might be trap, neuter, release cats that need to be re-released. So that would be why they're not adopted out. We might have dogs coming in that are returned to owner, cats that are returned to owner. So it's just all part of the bigger story. And it's really important to look at numbers like that in the bigger story. The other things to look at are 6% of horses are transferred out compared to 16% of dogs and cats. And again, this talks about that transfer programs that are all kind of up and coming. So there's a lot of room for growth in horses being transferred out of areas with high numbers of horses in shelters and low numbers of available adopters to areas with high numbers of available adopters and lower numbers of horses in shelters. For horses, 2% are returned to the owner, compared to 12% with dogs and cats. And again, that fits into the story of higher numbers of law enforcement confiscations, higher numbers of owner relinquishment. So if an owner is willingly surrendering their animal, they're probably less likely to be returned that animal because they're saying outright they can't keep it. They're not in a situation to be able to care for it. So we're gonna, just because of that, see lower numbers likely of horses returned to owners. For euthanasia, 11% of horses euthanized as an outcome, 11% of dogs. And I think this is actually a pretty exciting statistic. So historically, and this is where a lot of work in sheltering has come so far. Historically, you know, we were seeing numbers 30, 40 years ago as high as 60% of higher of these animals, dogs and cats, being euthanized in shelters. And now we're down to 11%. And we're seeing the same thing in horses. So that would be 11%, usually be signifying of health and behavioral issues that are not able to be, I don't want to say fixed, but not able to be supported appropriately. And either for safety, wellness, humane reasons, those animals have had to be euthanized. And that's not inclusive of owner requested euthanasia. So a lot of organizations out there have owner requested euthanasia, which is an owner needs help accessing euthanasia services. So the euthanized in shelter is usually not indicative of that. We also have 2% dying of natural causes, and both horses and dogs and cats, which are very similar numbers. And then in horses, I don't want to say for obvious reasons, but you know, again, the story of keeping livestock, returned to the field in dogs and cats and lost in care in dogs and cats is, you know, a couple percent compared to 0% in horses. If you lose a horse from your shelter, you're gonna kind of probably find it pretty quickly. It's more difficult with dogs and cats just based on their smaller animals. If you're in high density urban areas, it can be difficult. If you're in rural areas, it can be difficult. Things happen. But again, it's going to be harder to physically lose a horse while it's in care. And there's also not a lot of situations where we're going to TNR, trap, neuter, release a horse. You know, we don't take horses from feral stray situations, neuter them, and then re-release them. This is not, you know, BLM is a whole different discussion. Mustangs is a whole different discussion. We're talking specifically about owned horses. So there's not really situations where horses are taken in, castrated, and then, you know, re-released back to the mines of West Virginia. So the next part of the discussion would be why animals are coming into shelters. Looking at horses, and this is information coming from the EWDC report. So looking at horses, we have all sorts of different reasons, and the reasons are very similar for dogs and cats. So for the EWDC, these are organizations reporting what their most common reasons are. So that's why it doesn't add up to 100% because they're able to select multiple reasons. So the percentage you see are the percentage of the reporting organization. So 68% of the 178 organizations for this question for equine welfare said owner finances were a reason for needing to surrender. And 31% equine age, 34% equine health. So looking at it accumulatively, we have 55% of reporting organizations said horse-related issues were one of the reasons why owners needed to surrender. And 77% of reporting organizations said owner-related issues were a reason to surrender. So owner-related issues, owner health, owner age, owner finances, owner relocating, horse-related issues, horse behavior, horse age, horse health, all different aspects that kind of are very different situations and may even vary greatly regionally. And yeah, so there's a question, does owner age include those who die without a plan for relocating horses? So that would look at owner health. Typically owner died is kind of usually in the other, but yes, that does absolutely account for owners who died and did not have a plan for relocating their horses. So usually that means some part of the family calls the shelter and say, I now need to rehome this horse. And for all kinds of reasons, Ashley will love to talk to you about estate planning if that is something your rescue or shelter organization needs help with. But yes, that is definitely a concern. It is much more, and again, this is part of the discussion on logistics. It is much more logistically difficult to have your mother or your child rehome your horse if you pass away, comparative to rehoming a dog or a cat. So looking at dog or cat relinquishment. So this is a study that came out from the ASPCA in 2015, and they made this wonderful graphic for it. So they have with dogs and cats for reported rehoming, pet-related reasons was about 46% comparative to owner-related reasons. So in horses, just going back, we see many more owner-related reasons or a more significant importance placed by shelters on owner-related reasons compared to dogs and cats. So again, this is a bigger talk about logistics and how the logistics of dealing with livestock and owning livestock affect rehoming livestock and sheltering livestock, and kind of how we help support owners in need and at-risk horses in general. So the main point, what this all comes down to, is talking about logistics. And as I don't want to say assume, but it's safe to probably assume many of us are hands-on horse people. A lot of this information might seem kind of like, duh, yeah, who doesn't know that moments, but it's really important to say it out loud and be kind of very open in our discussion about the logistical differences of not just keeping and owning horses, but sheltering them in general and providing welfare organization support to them. So one is physiology. Horses are bigger. Their needs are different from dogs and cats, and not just bigger because there's big dogs or small dogs. I have Great Danes, friends have Chihuahuas, you know, there's physiological differences like that, but it's the resource needs that come with those physiological differences. So horses need several pounds of hay a day. They need grain a day if they're in that kind of situation, and the physical space to keep them is much, much different based on their physiology. And that affects so many different aspects of sheltering and just supporting, and why those needs for owners might become difficult. So when you have an owner with a Shih Tzu who becomes elderly, that is a much different situation than when you have an owner with 4 Belgian draft horses who becomes elderly and can no longer push the manure. Transport in general is also very difficult. So when we look at these transferring in and out, why have these programs not, you know, exploded with transferring horses from areas of low demand to high demand in these sheltering situations? Transport is logistically difficult. So that wonderful Time article about transporting dogs, they're doing vans of dogs. So vans of dogs, trucks of dogs, you can have one person transporting 20, 30, 40 dogs on an airplane and a truck at once and move significant amounts of animals very efficiently. It's still very expensive, but it can be much more efficient. With horses, if we're talking about flying horses from California to Boston or something like that, California to the Ark in New York, we're looking at, you know, getting 10 horses on a flight for $100,000. That's a much different conversation. Or we're talking about shipping 8 horses on an air ride semi for 3 days across the country. That's a much different logistical situation in terms of transporting these horses from low demand areas to high demand areas. And there's people much smarter than me that are figuring it out, but in terms of time wise, you know, it's a significant consideration. And housing, so we talked about physiology, their larger body needs. Housing is one consideration for that, and something that kind of that story starts to be told a little bit in the economic impact study. But as we look at housing, housing isn't just the physical building you need to house the horse, but things like land access and access to acreage and large amounts of land. So that is a conversation that has been kind of happening nationally, and how we see losses of land and loss to access of land, people being forced to sell their farms or being in an economic situation where it's better for them personally to sell their farm to a subdevelopment. So then we're losing farmland. How's that affecting our shelters, and how's that affecting owners in need? So what does that mean for demand of resources for supporting horses and owners in need? Spay neuter is another consideration as well. So in terms of horses, we're talking castration. It's not really common to spay a mare unless it's for a medical need, but dogs and cats is very frequent. So that means we're seeing a much more controlled population now that shelters are able to spay neuter pretty much anything. Many states have laws that require all animals being adopted from shelters to be spayed or neutered. In horses, that can be logistically expensive for shelters to do. And not every owner is able to do that. So we have stallions coming in, we have more bred mares coming in to shelters. And that just is all part of the bigger discussion on what resources are needed to care for those animals, and also how we help prevent unwanted horses, or I don't want to say unwanted horses, but unintentional breedings happening out in the public, and which may be future down the line horses needing care and shelters. The other kind of considerations are behavioral training for the horse and human training. So volunteers, it's a lot harder to find volunteers who have horse specific knowledge. Ashley and I both worked in a rescue that did small animal and large animal, and you have a much larger base of help for the small animals and the large animals. And that's not to say people can't be trained. It just takes a little longer to train people to be self-sufficient in handling livestock and understanding kind of all the physical cues for livestock. So on the flip side of that, finding behavioral training. Where I am in Massachusetts, I can throw a stick and hit, 50 different dog trainers in a 5-mile radius, but I'll maybe find 5 horse trainers who are available to come to a shelter and help facilitate behavioral training for horses in need. That also means that owners in need of behavioral training might have a little bit more difficulty accessing help if they have behavioral needs with a horse. So again, all logistics. And the last one, which is going to be part of our panel discussion that we're going to move on to, is animal control and law enforcement facilitation. So we have all of these horses coming in from law enforcement, at much higher rates compared to dogs and cats. What does that mean for law enforcement's handling skills, for local municipalities' kind of logistical efforts in terms of handling and managing these horses? We're going to talk about that next, but it's a huge part of the discussion on making sure that horses and owners are supported and getting the help they need. And then kind of the last final point I always like to make is why it's important to keep collecting data. We have all this data on dogs and cats, but we still need more. We are starting to get a lot more data on horses. We still need more. So the one thing we need to do is to be able to track changing needs within the community. The pandemic is a great kind of example of this, because the pandemic, things were changing so rapidly that the data we had isn't even necessarily applicable anymore. That's something we won't know until we have more data. But again, it's important to stay on top of it to understand what the changing needs of owners are and what the changing assistance out there available is. We also want to identify the capacity of assistant programs. Is there enough capacity? Is it regionally based? Are there regions that have lower capacity that need help? We also want to understand what programs best address owner needs. So in horses, if we're seeing owner-related reasons being more significant than animal-related reasons for rehoming compared to small animals, how is that reflected in these preventative programs? And we also want to help funders direct grants. So we find all this information. Suddenly we know what programs are going to be most effective. How do people know, how do the funders know where to direct grants? So it's really important that we all just keep getting this information out there and getting this information out there. So moving on, we're going to do a panelist Q&A, and we have 2 panelists today. And our first panelist is Ed Jamison. So Ed, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I am Ed Jamison. Thank you so much for having me today. I am currently the CEO for Operation Kindness, which is a nonprofit dog and cat shelter just north of the city of Dallas. Prior to that, I've been in animal control for nearly 20 years, small suburb outside of the city of Cleveland. Then I ran the city of Cleveland's animal care and control. And then until just over a year ago, or just less than a year ago, I was a director for Dallas Animal Services, which had the 3rd highest dog and cat intake in the country, just shy of 40,000 dogs and cats in 2019. And I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Ed. And our next panelist, who is in the chat today, is Ashley.
Hi, everybody. Most of you are probably familiar with me. I started my journey. I went for pre-vet school at UVM, and I wanted to specialize in equines. And I decided to take a year off. I was a little burnt out, started working for a rescue, and just absolutely fell in love with the work. I was there as the shelter's horse and livestock liaison for about 14 years or so. And then I left on maternity leave and ended up working for the United Horse Coalition, which is my current home. Absolutely love the work that we're doing, and I'm really happy to be able to get the chance to work with Emily and see how we can better be using the data coming out of the equine welfare data collective and apply that in real world scenarios. So
thank you, Ashley. So today, my questions for Ed and Ashley are going to focus mostly, and let me hold on, I'm gonna stop the screen share so we can focus on their wonderful faces. Now I've lost my questions. I'm going to ask you guys. Hold on. So my questions for you guys today are going to focus on kind of how these logistical differences are affecting, or not affecting, but kind of changing the focus and direction of animal control, of preventative programs for owners, which is kind of Ashley's wheelhouse, and what this conversation moving forward looks like. So a question for you, Ed, and I prepped Ed to say it's totally fine to answer you don't know for any of these questions, because that's all about data collection, right? It's totally fine to say you don't know, because all that means is we need to find out. So Ed, do you know how many animal control officers are operating in the US?
The short answer to that is no. One thing I can tell you is that the companion animal welfare world has done a much better job in the last decade of collecting data on animals. Where they have missed is collecting data on humans. And a very thorough presentation that you had with data, Emily, it is, from my seat, it's very interesting to see the similarities with equines, and then the things that are not exactly the same. But until we can really understand the humans, and then you put 2 years ago with COVID and all the changes to human behavior, human situations have really thrown us in the companion animal world, really have us scrambling, trying to find alternate methods, because the numbers are just not the same when you're just looking at the animals. And I think that we have to do a much better job on the humans in the field. That being said, when you get to the number of actual ACOs, again, it's really, really difficult, but there's over 3,000 counties in the country. Again, some local governments have their own shelters as well, but typically many states are set up that there's some type of animal control at a county level. And again, agencies just vary. I had 226 employees when I was at Dallas Animal Services, down to I was a one-person show when I worked for Garfield Heights outside of the city of Cleveland. So the actual number of ACOs is an unknown number at this point.
So to put that into perspective, and it's safe to assume kind of every ACO is handling small animal, companion animals, right? Dogs and cats. So for us, when we've tried to collect data from municipal shelters, we've gotten responses from 3 nationally out of those kind of 3,000. So part of our picture is working harder to understand what the municipal representation of kind of working with horses, and especially when we look at the number of municipal organizations that have responded to the percentage difference in law enforcement confiscations. It's a pretty interesting kind of part of the conversation that feels like a blind spot a little bit for us. Do you know, or have you kind of heard anecdotally from the NACA members who's dealing with horses, or kind of what percentage of LEOs are dealing with horses?
One thing in municipal work is, at the end of the day, the local government is the lowest common denominator. So even though most states give authority to deal with strays or even cruelty to other entities, at the end of the day, if they don't do it, which is what happens in the city of Dallas, the sheriff by state law is given the authority over stray horses. We would get a response from the sheriff's department on a healthy stray horse, but anything that was sick or injured, they just wouldn't come. And at the end of the day, they're calling a council person, who's calling the city manager, who's calling the mayor, and they're going to call that local animal control agency. So all of the places that I've worked in 20 years, at the end of the day, I would have to respond to anything. There was not the horse situation in the city of Garfield Heights, but in the city of Cleveland, didn't happen often, but I did respond to horse calls in the city of Cleveland. Dallas, particularly southern Dallas, you would have to respond to it. And so at the end of the day, most ASOs, unless they have a contract that specifically, crystal clear they are not dealing with horses, the local government is going to ultimately end up having to respond to any type of livestock, including horse calls.
Awesome. So, and Julie just pointed out, I totally forgot to go over the acronyms. So LEO is law enforcement officer, ACO is animal control officer, and NACA, NACA is and please correct me if I'm wrong, the National Animal Control Association.
Care and Control Association.
Care and Control. I always want to say, I always go back and forth. Yeah, the National Animal Care and Control Association. And Ed is also representing them today. So in terms of, and Ashley, this one's a good pitch for you too. Ashley did a lot of animal control as well in her varied history. So in terms of the law enforcement processes for, let's just say, confiscating large animals versus small animals, Ed, in your experience, what's kind of the differences in the process for that?
Oh boy, logistically, and you use that word a lot in your presentation, it's night and day different logistically. Legally, oftentimes they are the same. On occasion, a state law or a local law might actually differentiate from livestock, equine compared to a dog or a cat. Usually not. There are some ordinances that might say dog or cat specific, and then everything else says if an animal. So they're not considered sentient beings, and I don't know of any states that have that yet. I know a couple have tried. So typically they come into, legally they're looked at as property, and you are looking at what do I have to do to get ownership so that I can then move forward with disposition. And the state of Ohio is much more difficult in the livestock as far as once you actually can gain ownership, because as you saw in your length of stay data, that is the same stuff for all livestock. It is much harder than a dog or a cat that typically will have anywhere from a 0-day hold up to a 10 or a 14-day, depending on the jurisdiction. And then you at least can start looking for hopefully a positive, a live outcome for it. Sometimes, as we saw in the numbers, euthanasia is the only option. But when you don't own that animal, you then logistically can't even move it. And when you're in a situation like the city of Dallas, city of Cleveland, everywhere I've been, we did not have stables. So we were really having to get creative when we got any type of livestock. And the bigger the animal got, we handled big dogs every day, all day. When you got a horse, a cow, and anything like that, just night and day. We had one shed that, quite frankly, with the heat in Dallas, we knew we had till about 11:30 to find an outcome for that animal with a partner group, or we were going to be dealing with cruelty situations ourselves because it was not equipped for holding horse. But we put many of horses in there for like overnight while we tried to work with partners to at least get the housing part taken care of.
That legal logistics is a great point. Ashley and I have both had experience with that. Ashley, do you have anything? Ashley, I know you've had personally. I know I've been on those midnight trailer pickups with you, and we always go back to the 9 feral donkeys. But in terms of anything to add, do you have anything to add to that?
It just comes down to that comparison of how many cat and dog shelters you have access to, as opposed to how many equine shelters you have access to. And when you're an animal control officer, you're dealing with your town, and every town is different, and not every town has the type of facility to take in a horse. So they're dealing just mainly with cats and dogs. A lot of times they'll contract with a local rescue, or just rely on them, don't even have a contract with them. And unfortunately, as Ed was mentioning, when you get these horses that are in a law enforcement case, a confiscation, they are treated like property, and you can end up with a horse that is in your facility or in a rescue for upwards of 5 years while you're dealing with the court cases. And that is a huge amount of money, amount of resources for a rescue to have to take on. But again, it comes down to each town and municipality is very different in terms of what they will take on when it comes to livestock and horses.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna do 2 more minutes and then we'll open up the Q&A to everybody else. But so I think talking about ACOs, and if we're looking at how a lot more horses are coming in from law enforcement than dogs and cats, how can local rescues build relationships with their ACOs? What do you think some good places to start with that is?
understanding the jurisdiction. And I'm here in DFW, 15 million people in the Metroplex. I don't even know how many total different municipalities, but everyone is different. You have state law dictating, usually very, very high level. And then as you start to drill down, and so if you are a rescue that specializes in equines, definitely reach out to that municipality to form that relationship. Because I can tell you there are very few municipalities that are going to be turning away a rescue partner able to help. When it happened the very few times in the city of Cleveland, we just didn't have very much, and we're calling on anybody and everybody. And luckily, some of the more rural counties had nonprofit rescues that were the ones that I would lean on when I got into something like that. In the city of Dallas, which is a really, really big municipality that still has tons of rural parts, and in the more underserved area south of Interstate 30. But we worked with the SPCA of Texas, who did have the ability, had the trailers, had the equipment, had stables that they could take animals to. And until very recently, didn't have a formal agreement with them. And I think that that's really, really important. If you're a group that most municipalities are going to say, thank you. I might only have to call on you once every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. But when you are in the heat of the moment, get a call to respond to something, it's much better to have a plan in place and know that you have those relationships already met, as opposed to getting a cold call. Hi, I'm Ed from so-and-so. Can you help me with this stray horse that I just found? Having that set up ahead of time is going to pay huge dividends when you do have a situation.
And I think to add to that, if it's okay, making sure, if you're a rescue that offers large animal technical training, to offer that to your local municipalities, because a lot of animal control officers don't have that experience with horses, so they shy away from that. And if you can get them comfortable and get them training, they're more likely to, to help out.
And even something as simple, that's a great point, Ashley. Even something as simple as asking your local fire department to come over to teach them how to put a halter on. I think people think large animal technical rescue and they're talking slings and, horse helmets and vets there with sedatives and tranquilizers. But something as simple as teaching the local fire department how to put a halter on to get a horse out of a barn in place of emergency, if you have local wildfires, if you have earthquake situations, things like that, local natural disasters, that can be just as helpful in terms of making sure they're also capable of, using a backhoe to get a horse out of a ditch.
And I really think it's important understanding what type of laws there are also, because you don't want the rescue to get stuck. Hey, you did something because you had the technical ability, you had done, the training and the understanding, and hey, they help. Sure, go ahead and take this animal. And then all of a sudden you're now stuck. You saw those length of stay numbers, that it's going to be 300 days if things go good in many of those situations. So again, that relationship, having those discussions. And if you're in certain areas that just don't deal with this very much, they're not going to be thinking about the hold times or anything like that. So it's much better to have those discussions ahead of time. The rescuers who will go and take a dog from somebody's property now, like, you're breaking the law, you're stealing that under the law. You may have the best intentions, and it's no different when it comes to equine. So again, all of this kind of wraps in that it's much better to talk about them ahead of time as opposed to once a situation happens.
Yeah, thank you both. Okay, so we're going to open up the floor and we're going to do it two ways. So one, if you're on your computer on Zoom, do your little raise hand thing and we'll call on you. And Julie, I think you have unmute powers if someone's muted. Julie can unmute you. Otherwise, you can put your question in the chat. And just while we wait for questions to come through, if any of you want to watch this again, we are recording this, and then we're also happy to send the slides out. And I'm, again, welcome to chat further over email, over phone call about any of the data you've seen today. And we've had, Ed, I don't want to speak for Ed, but we've been talking with Jerica through NACA. So we are looking into future kind of online educational opportunities for animal control officers, for potentially rescues working with animal control officers. So some of that might be coming down the pipeline. I did see a couple questions regarding that. I don't know about a bilingual platform, but if somebody wants to be in charge of translating anything we do, you're more than welcome to. We definitely would not shy away from help with that. All right, so I don't know, Ashley or Julie, did you see any questions in the chat that I missed catching just while we were doing the presentation?
So I did want to respond to the question about bilingual, because that is on our radar for 2022 at the American Horse Council. We're getting ready to do some new program content, and we are getting ready for a new economic impact study, and we would really like to reach a wide variety of different diverse populations. So bilingual is on the horizon, just so you know. But no, Emily, I did not see I think I did see one question early on, but I think you caught it.
I have seen, so a bunch of stuff in the chat, or all of you really great programs out there mentioning your program to making sure we're aware of it. If you have a program, I highly recommend you reach out to Ashley to make sure that you are in the United Horse Coalition's equine research database. So that database that Ashley runs is free to everybody. And what we do is we list every single custodial program, every single prevention program, at-risk support program available to horse owners in the country on the United Horse Coalition website. So if you have a program and you don't know if it's in our database, definitely reach out to Ashley, because we want to make sure that information is accessible to everybody and anybody. So Eva said, are there certain areas in the US that struggle with providing support for horse rescue more than others? That's a really great question. So in one of our EWDC reports, what we did was we compared the availability of, or the accessibility of equine welfare organizations in terms of the general population. And what we found is the number of organizations is directly tied to population density. So, you know, it's one of those kind of oh duh moments, but now we have the data behind that to support it. So higher population areas are going to have a greater number of equine welfare organizations. What does that mean in terms of providing support? That could mean in more rural areas, you're looking at longer distances to travel to assist horse owners, or you're looking at longer distances for horse owners to receive help. That doesn't necessarily mean people aren't getting help in rural areas, but again, that just is kind of part of that bigger logistical discussion. So, you know, I could probably have logistical discussion tattooed on my forehead at this point, but it is such a major consideration when we're talking about dealing with livestock and dealing with supporting at-risk horses and owners in need. Rosie asked, the United Horse Council estate planning publication, maybe we distribute that to our supporters.
Absolutely.
Yes, please do. Yeah, Ashley, feel free to talk about that. Feel free to stump for yourself.
One of the things that we're actually working on, so going back to the data that Emily showed you, again, one of the big reasons horses are being surrendered is to not because of the horse, but because of owner-related issues. So what we've really been trying to tackle at UHC is going back to stopping this at the source, preventative care. And we recently did a presentation on responsible ownership with a focus on the question, what happens to your horse if something happens to you? So helping owners to understand that if something happened to them today, does their horse have proper training so that anybody can go in there and have a better chance of rehoming that horse? Are you up to date on any medical issues? Have you attended to anything outstanding? You know, we talk about things like estate planning, so making sure you have a plan in place for your horse. You know, setting up a trust for them if something happens to you, making sure that your barn owner, that your friends and family understand what you want done with your horse if something happens to you today. This presentation is available on the website. We're happy to give it to you know, give it to anybody if you have you know, if any of our rescues are here today and you want us to present this, you know, reach out to us. We're happy to do that. But yes, absolutely. Use any of the materials on our website. If you want a PDF copy, I can get that to you. USEF, I think, actually did they made it a little bit prettier. So I'm going to see if I can get a hold of that copy, and we'll put that up on the site as well.
We're also, as we talk about strategic planning and that kind of stuff, just in our last 2-minute stump, we're looking into, or Ashley's looking into, developing new owner information packets. So if any of you are adopting horses out and maybe want to work with Ashley to help her put together, all the information you think is critical for your new owners to have. She's looking to eventually put together new owner packets that shelters, rescues, people adopting horses can just, throw at new owners and say, this is all the really important information you need. Things like estate planning, how to find vets, stuff like that. So definitely reach out to Ashley if you have needs or desires to help with that. So I think we're going to wrap it up there today. I want to do a big thank you to Ed. Really, thank you for joining us. Your information was so insightful. And Ashley, thank you for sitting in on the panel today. And again, if any of you have any questions, want to repeat this, want the recording for this, we will share the recording once it's posted. Feel free to email me at ewdc@horsecouncil.org. You can email Julie, it's info@horsecouncil.org, or Ashley at uhc@horsecouncil.org. And Ed, if you want to throw your email address out one more time, if you have any questions for Ed, feel free to email him.
Yes, it's E. Jamison, JAMISON @operationkindness.org. And you're all doing great work. Keep it up.
Thanks,
Awesome. Thank you, Ed. Nice to have you today. And thank you everybody for attending.